0913 local time. Caribbean Sea. The sun had been up long enough to burn the haze off the water and lay clean light across a flat, blue surface that stretched unbroken to the horizon. Visibility pushed past 15 nautical miles in every direction. Sea state was low, the kind of morning that offers no cover and no excuses. A U.S. Navy carrier strike group was holding its course through international waters on a routine daylight transit. No exercises scheduled, no alerts in force, nothing about the operational picture to suggest the next 2 hours would be anything other than standard. On the bridge, the horizon was empty and even. Flight operations were paused. Aircraft sat secured on deck. Deck crews moved through their checks with the quiet efficiency of people who have completed the same sequence hundreds of times. Nothing in the scene was hurried. Nothing needed to be. A carrier never moves through these waters unaccompanied. Destroyers and cruisers held their assigned positions in a layered defensive screen that extended miles outward from the carrier in every direction. Each ship was tied into the same shared tactical network. Air and surface radars ran continuous sweeps. Electronic support measures monitored the signal environment. Below the surface, passive sensors listened. Every feed from every platform converged inside the Combat Information Center, the CIC, where watch teams tracked, classified, and logged everything that registered across the picture. At 0916, the surface display showed routine traffic. Merchant vessels on predictable headings, regional patrol craft maintaining their distance, fishing boats working the edges of established routes. Standard Caribbean morning. Nothing warranted a second look. Then, along the outer edge of the radar coverage, a small cluster of contacts materialized. 6 surface vessels, loosely grouped, maintaining moderate speed. At first pass, nothing about them stood apart. 6 ships moving in proximity on calm, open water was not by itself a reason to redirect attention. By 0918, the watch team was refining the tracks, hull dimensions, wake geometry, emissions profile. Venezuelan naval vessels, still distant, still operating within normal parameters. At 0920, the speed data changed. One contact accelerated first, pushing above 12 knots. A second followed within seconds. Then the rest in rapid sequence until all 6 were climbing in speed simultaneously, their headings adjusting as they went. Not drifting, adjusting. The kind of coordinated shift that required a single directive, not independent initiative. Geometry is a language at sea. What the geometry was now saying was specific. 6 ships accelerating together in a tightening formation toward a projected intercept with the carrier. The CIC updated the bridge. Closest point of approach began compressing. Projected timelines shortened. At 0922, bridge-to-bridge radio hails went out on the standard international frequencies. Professional, clear, compliant with every applicable maritime procedure. The message requested identification and course clarification to maintain safe separation. No response. A second hail followed in English, then Spanish. A third, silence across all frequencies. On the flight deck, operations continued without change. That decision was deliberate. In a daylight encounter with open visibility and no weather to obscure what either side was doing, every visible action carried meaning. A carrier that responds to approaching ships by visibly altering its routine signals something it may not intend to signal. Stability communicates confidence. Disruption communicates uncertainty. The deck stayed calm. Inside the CIC, classification continued sharpening. Formation spacing indicated deliberate command control, not loose coordination. Wake pattern analysis confirmed sustained and synchronized acceleration. Emissions monitoring showed navigation radars operating normally. No fire control signals, no weapons targeting tones. But the behavior of the formation was saying something the electronic picture did not need to confirm. 6 ships were moving fast, together, toward the same point. By 0925, the Venezuelan vessels were closing at a rate that made minutes the relevant unit of measurement. Their wakes stretched long and white across the sunlit water, clearly visible through optics from the bridge. Distance was decreasing. Time to closest point of approach was narrowing with each radar sweep. Still, no alarm was called. Rules of engagement were reviewed and understood. The carrier group was operating lawfully. There was no legal basis to alter course and no justification to escalate. The objective was what it had been since the contacts first appeared. Control of space, control of tempo, and control of the decision timeline. Intent was being allowed to declare itself, and intent was becoming readable. In daylight, there is nowhere to hide the shape of a maneuver, no weather to blame, no poor visibility to exploit later as explanation. 6 warships accelerating in coordination toward a U.S. aircraft carrier in open international water. Everyone on board understood the weight of what was developing, not because of what had already happened, but because of the narrow window of what had not yet happened and what could. 0926, Caribbean Sea. By mid-morning, the monitoring phase had given way to something more deliberate on both sides. On the radar displays inside the CIC, the 6 Venezuelan ships were no longer peripheral entries at the edge of the picture. They were primary contacts, and their behavior had compressed the relevant geometry considerably. Speed had stabilized above 20 knots, well past patrol cruising rate. Headings were now unmistakably convergent. Track histories showed synchronized acceleration with no lag and no hesitation between vessels. This was formation movement operating under unified direction, not 6 independent ships making similar choices. One command, 6 platforms executing it. At 0927, the projected closest point of approach for 2 of the lead vessels dropped below 5 nautical miles and continued to shrink with each update cycle. The bridge was kept current in real time. Another radio hail went out, more direct in phrasing but still measured in tone. The carrier reiterated its lawful position in international waters and requested course clarification. No reply. On the flight deck, sunlight reflected off parked aircraft and the textured non-skid surface beneath them. Deck crews continued standard maintenance checks. No jets were spotted for launch. No general quarters was sounded. The operational posture on deck communicated exactly what the situation required. A ship that was entirely aware of what was happening and entirely unconcerned by it. That projection was accurate and deliberate. Inside the CIC, the surface picture updated every few seconds. Wake angles were measured and logged. Rate of closure was recalculated continuously. Each refresh closed the window for ambiguity slightly further. At sea, escalation does not usually arrive as a single decisive event. It accumulates through increments of math. At 0930, one Venezuelan vessel altered heading slightly. Not parallel to the carrier's course, but angled toward its projected forward position. A second ship mirrored the adjustment from a different bearing. The remaining 4 held speed and maintained loose arc formation. This was pressure applied through geometry rather than direct aggression, advancing from multiple angles, compressing the space available for a comfortable defensive response, without any single action crossing a legal threshold. The officer of the deck reviewed rules of engagement. Nothing had changed on the legal side of the ledger. No weapons were manned, no fire control radar had been detected. But the combination of sustained silence and decreasing separation was its own kind of statement. The risk in this kind of encounter was not an overt hostile act. The risk was that proximity, in the absence of communication, created the conditions for miscalculation that neither side had chosen, but both had to manage. At 0933, optical confirmation was obtained. High-resolution cameras tracked the approaching ships in full daylight clarity. Hull markings were readable. Deck activity was visible. Sensor configurations were logged. Personnel were visible topside. No weapons were trained outward, but activity near forward mounts was noted and added to the record. Everything was being documented as it occurred. Another radio hail, shorter this time, unambiguous in content. Again, nothing came back across the channel. The distance continued to close. At 0935, the nearest Venezuelan ship crossed inside 4 nautical miles. Wake turbulence was now visible to the naked eye from the carrier's bridge wing. Long white trails running across sunlit water toward the ship. No course adjustment followed the threshold crossing. Inside the CIC, the atmosphere was controlled but dense. Voices stayed level. Every report came in clipped and precise. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was speculative. Every decision was taken deliberately because impulsive decisions in compressed situations tend to produce the kind of outcomes that no one involved had authorized. By 0938, all 6 ships were inside a tightening envelope. Formation spacing had compressed. Speeds held constant. Headings were fixed. The absence of any communication was itself a data point now. Not simply the absence of a reply, but an active choice that shaped the character of the encounter. A ship that chooses silence while accelerating toward another ship in open water is making a statement. The statement was being received and logged. The carrier's bridge and CIC coordinated continuously. The carrier group would hold course and speed. Altering heading at this stage would introduce ambiguity where clarity was the stronger position. In a daylight encounter with complete visibility, clarity was the instrument of control. At 0940, the margins had narrowed to the point where every degree of rudder and every knot of speed carried consequence. A miscalculation by either side, mechanical, perceptual, or procedural, could convert proximity into incident without either commanding officer having intended it. The encounter had reached the compressed decision space where training and doctrine either held or they didn't. The carrier did not flinch. No alarms, no sudden movements, no escalation transmitted through behavior. 6 Venezuelan warships were closing fast in full daylight, and what came next would determine whether this remained a test of institutional nerve or became something that could not be walked back. 0941. Caribbean Sea, late morning. The encounter reached its inflection point not with raised voices or sudden orders, but with the kind of quiet coordination that only becomes visible after the fact, when the record is reviewed and the sequence is reconstructed. At 0941, the carrier strike group shifted into a heightened awareness posture. This was not escalation in the conventional sense. It was control becoming more explicit. Sensors that had been operating in a broad passive mode were now tasked with specific assignments. Radar modes adjusted. Electro-optical systems focused on assigned contacts. The layered picture of the Venezuelan formation, visual, electronic, positional, became more granular with each passing update. No weapons were brought to readiness. The distinction carried operational weight. There is a meaningful difference between demonstrating awareness and demonstrating intent. The carrier group was managing the former precisely to avoid the latter. At 0943, a helicopter was cleared to lift from the deck. The launch was unhurried. Rotors turned. The aircraft rose cleanly into clear Caribbean air without urgency or ceremony, just a procedure executed exactly as trained. Nothing about the launch was theatrical. Everything about it was purposeful. From altitude, the picture that the surface sensors had been assembling in data now existed in full visual form. Hull numbers were legible, deck configurations were catalogued. Wake patterns confirmed what the radar had already established. Sustained speed, coordinated spacing, deliberate heading. Every observation was time-stamped. Every frame was geolocated. The documentation was continuous and complete. Back in the CIC, the information flow held steady. Visual feeds synchronized with radar track data. Electronic support measures continued their passive sweep of the frequency environment. Fire control signals, still absent. Missile guidance tones, still absent. But the behavior of 6 warships operating under unified command and closing distance without communication remained a complete tactical statement on its own. At 0946, the helicopter established a stable observation orbit at a separation that maintained visibility without constituting provocation. The implicit message required no broadcast. Every maneuver was being observed in real time, from the air in full daylight. There would be no post-encounter dispute about what had occurred and when. At 0948, a subtle change appeared in the formation's behavior. One vessel eased its speed marginally, just enough to be measurable. Another adjusted heading by a few degrees. Small changes, but in the context of a clear, calm morning with unrestricted observation from both surface and air, small changes were the only kind that mattered. The helicopter crew logged the adjustments and held orbit. By 0950, the helicopter had repositioned slightly to maintain observation angle as the Venezuelan formation's geometry shifted. The adjustment communicated nothing beyond what it was: continued surveillance. Every degree of movement on both sides was now being fed into a record that would exist permanently regardless of how the encounter resolved. Still, no warnings were transmitted. Still, no aggressive actions were taken. Still, the carrier held course. In encounters that operate in the gray space between normal activity and declared hostility, the decisive factor is rarely a single dramatic moment. It is cumulative. Who controls the pace? Who defines the terms? Who is willing to hold position under sustained pressure long enough for the math to shift in their favor? The carrier group was controlling the pace. It had been controlling the pace since 0920. The Venezuelan formation was beginning to register that. By 0952, the visible cohesion of the formation had started to loosen. Spacing between ships widened slightly. Speeds began to vary across the group. The synchronized pressure that had defined the approach since 0920 was starting to lose its geometric precision under sustained, documented observation in full daylight. Both sides understood what was happening. In open water with clear skies and complete visibility on both ends, escalation would produce a permanent record. There were no shadows to reinterpret later, no ambiguity to claim. Every action was observable, measurable, and being preserved in real time. At 0955, the carrier's combined picture, surface sensors, helicopter feeds, and the electronic support data flowing in from the escort screen had produced complete situational understanding of the Venezuelan formation without a single weapon being trained or a single threshold being crossed. The carrier group had not changed course, had not altered speed, had not raised any system to a state that could be characterized as threatening. And yet the encounter was no longer being driven by the approaching formation. The dynamic had shifted. Quietly, without announcement, control of the encounter's pace had passed to the carrier group, not through force, but through the combination of documented presence, sustained stability, and the simple, unmistakable fact that everything the Venezuelan ships were doing was being seen, recorded, and understood in real time. What followed would determine how the morning ended. 0956, Caribbean Sea. The final phase of the encounter began not with a dramatic announcement, but with physics. Speed tells the truth before words do, and in calm water under direct sunlight, a ship's wake is one of the most honest instruments available. At 09:58, the helicopter crew saw it first. One Venezuelan warship reduced throttle. The wake behind its hull shortened. The long white trail that had been building steadily since 09:20 began to narrow and fade, a few knots removed from a heading that had been held for nearly 40 minutes. Seconds later, a second vessel followed. Its bow shifted a few degrees off the carrier's projected course. Not a sharp turn, not a visible retreat, but a heading change that no longer pointed at the same place it had been pointed for the previous half hour. The remaining ships held their positions for a moment, formation beginning to widen at the edges, losing the tight spacing that had defined the approach. Inside the CIC, the update moved through the chain without urgency. The carrier maintained its heading and speed exactly as it had since the first contact was acquired. That consistency was not inertia. It was a deliberate choice, and its value was in its continuity. A ship that holds steady under sustained pressure communicates something that no maneuver can replicate. At 1000, the first radio transmission arrived. The voice was composed, formal, and notably different in character from the 40-minute silence that had preceded it. The message referenced routine patrol activity and proximity to Venezuelan waters. It offered no specifics, made no demands, and acknowledged nothing directly. But the act of transmitting was itself the meaningful data point. Communication had resumed. The U.S. Navy's response was immediate and calibrated. The carrier identified itself, restated its lawful presence in international waters, and confirmed clearly that its movements and the movements of the approaching ships had been continuously recorded. No threat was included, no warning was issued, just clarity, delivered in the same level, professional register that had characterized every U.S. transmission since 0922. By 1002, the change in the surface picture was visible without needing interpretation. The Venezuelan formation was no longer advancing as a coordinated unit. Speeds varied across the group, spacing continued to widen. Headings began to diverge in small but measurable increments, each ship adjusting slightly differently, the synchronized geometry of the earlier approach quietly disaggregating. From the bridge, sailors could now observe something beyond hull shapes and wake lines. They could see a decision being executed in real time. In full daylight, with clear water and no weather to obscure the picture, that decision was as legible as anything on the radar display. At 10:05, the helicopter completed a final extended orbit, holding observation without pressing closer. Cameras continued recording. The aircraft then turned back toward the carrier, its mission complete. At no point had it approached the Venezuelan ships. At no point had it been required to. The carrier never changed course. At 10:07, the nearest Venezuelan vessel crossed back outside the most critical proximity threshold. The time to closest point of approach calculation, which had been driving the encounter's urgency for the better part of an hour, began increasing rather than decreasing for the first time since 0920. Risk decreased. The geometry that had produced the tension of the morning started releasing pressure. This was not resolution by retreat. It was resolution by discipline. The carrier group's sustained, documented, unhurried control of space and tempo had defined the terms of the encounter from inside it, and those terms had held. By 1010, the situation had de-escalated in every measurable sense. The Venezuelan ships remained on the radar display. They were still visible in the sunlight, but their movements no longer indicated coordinated pressure toward the carrier. They had chosen separation over proximity, observation over confrontation, not because they were forced to by a weapons system, but because every other variable in the encounter had been controlled around them. Nothing had been fired. No alarm had been sounded. The carrier had not altered a single degree of heading. Every phase of the encounter had been seen, logged, and preserved. Every acceleration, every heading shift, every minute of silence on the radio channels, every moment when the range closed and the decision was made to hold steady rather than react, the record was complete and unambiguous. For the carrier group, the mission had been constant throughout. Presence, stability, control. The carrier had demonstrated none of these through force and all of them through conduct. As the helicopter was secured on deck and the CIC returned to its standard monitoring rhythm, the sea ahead looked unchanged. The horizon was flat and clear. The carrier continued along its planned route, holding the same heading it had been holding before 6 warships chose to accelerate toward it in open international water. In daylight, that continuity was its own conclusion. 1010, Caribbean Sea. With separation re-established and the encounter resolved, the carrier group settled back into its operational cadence. But what had unfolded over the previous hour carried implications that extended well beyond the specific patch of water where it occurred. In the full brightness of a Caribbean morning, 6 warships had pressed toward a U.S. aircraft carrier across open international water. And in that same brightness, with no weather to interpret charitably and no shadows to retreat into afterward, they had chosen to disengage. That outcome was not the product of chance. It was the product of a doctrine applied exactly as it was designed to be applied. Modern naval confrontations in the gray zone rarely begin with weapons. They begin with incremental geometry, speed changes, closing distances, coordinated headings, and the deliberate absence of communication. The goal is not combat. The goal is leverage. Pressure applied below the threshold of armed conflict, calibrated to generate a response that can then be used to justify the next increment of pressure. What matters most in these encounters is not who moves first, it is who controls the pace of the encounter from inside it. Throughout the morning, the carrier group controlled the pace. It maintained heading, it maintained speed, it transmitted on schedule, and responded to silence with clarity rather than alarm. In perfect visibility with calm seas and unrestricted observation, those decisions eliminated the ambiguity that gray zone tactics require to function. There was no overreaction to broadcast, no dramatic course change to film, no escalation to point to. The record, when reviewed, showed one side applying coordinated pressure and the other absorbing it without losing position or composure. This is where restraint becomes a form of dominance. Rules of engagement are often discussed as constraints, limits on what a force is permitted to do. In practice, they are instruments of control. They exist to close off the space where miscalculation and manipulation operate. By holding precisely within those rules while demonstrating complete situational awareness, the carrier group denied its counterpart the outcome the approach was designed to create. No narrative of American provocation was available. No escalation had been handed over to be repackaged. The record said something unambiguous: lawful transit, professional conduct, sustained situational control. Daylight enforced that record. In restricted visibility or darkness, intent can be argued. A maneuver can be described as routine. An acceleration can be attributed to sea conditions. In full sun, on calm water, with a helicopter overhead and every track time-stamped across multiple independent sensor systems, that kind of reframing is not available. Wake patterns do not negotiate. Formation spacing does not lie. When the Venezuelan ships reduced speed and adjusted heading, the shift was visible to the naked eye from the bridge. Equally visible was the fact that the carrier had not altered a single parameter of its operation from the moment the 6 contacts were first acquired to the moment the last one opened range and disengaged. The principle that produced this outcome has defined U.S. naval operations across contested waters for decades. Dominance is not a function of how close a ship gets to the threat in front of it. It is a function of whether it controls the air picture above it, the surface and subsurface around it, the information environment connecting its platforms, and the narrative that the encounter will generate afterward. Control those 4 elements and escalation becomes a choice that the other side is left holding. A choice with visible costs and no clean cover. On this morning in the Caribbean, the other side looked at those costs and chose not to pay them. The sailors who held their stations through those 90-odd minutes of narrowing geometry and sustained silence did not do so through bravado. They did so through preparation, through the accumulated repetition of drills, watch-standing rotations, rules of engagement reviews, and tactical exercises that produce the kind of institutional reflex that does not require a dramatic order at the critical moment. The system worked because the people inside it trusted it, and the training behind it trusted them. Strategically, the same dynamics playing out in the Caribbean repeat themselves across every contested maritime space on the planet. The Western Pacific, the South China Sea, the Eastern Mediterranean. The specific geography changes. The flags change. The calculation does not. How far can pressure be extended before restraint hardens into resolve? What does a Navy reveal about its actual capabilities when it chooses to hold position rather than maneuver? How does demonstrated capability, never explicitly threatened, communicate itself to an adversary who is watching from close range? The answer that emerged on this particular morning was the same answer these encounters tend to produce when the defending force holds its discipline. Restraint backed by documented, visible, comprehensive capability is not a passive condition. It is a posture that removes options from the other side faster than any weapon system deployed at range. As the carrier continued on its planned route and the Venezuelan ships receded on the display, the sea ahead remained exactly what it had appeared to be at 0913. Calm, open, fully visible in all directions. The question worth considering, and it applies to every similar encounter that will follow this one in this ocean or any other, is a straightforward one. When a U.S. carrier group responds to coordinated pressure with sustained discipline and zero visible reaction, is that posture a sign of confidence, or is it a restraint that at some point requires recalibration? Leave your position in the comments. Every perspective gets read. If this kind of documented real-world maritime analysis is what you're here for, encounters where the seconds compound and the outcome is measured in who controlled the space, then stay with us for the next one.